Okay, this lecture is about the California Gold Rush. The outcomes of the gold rush were number one, the founding of California and the massive population increase. So, as a result of the gold rush, we see the founding of California as a state within the United States. The second point is that, or the second outcome is intense racial conflict, culminating in the anti Chinese movement in particular and the genocide of Native Americans. So today I'm going to provide a very broad introduction to the gold rush. The reading due later this week focuses on Chinese Americans. My main focus today is going to be elsewhere, so I'll focus primarily on Native Americans. So as a reminder, it's estimated that in 1492 there were a minimum of 5 million Native inhabitants and as many as 15 million Native Americans in the continental U.S. And by the end of the 19th century, that population was down to just 250,000 people. So that's a huge decrease in the Native population. In the 19th century, or the 1800s, as the U.S. was moving westward, it used three main strategies to take care of what it viewed as the quote-unquote Indian problem. First, early in its history, removal. Move Indians to the west, move them onto reservations, perhaps most famously, Indian removal under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. The second strategy the U.S. government used was a policy of genocide or violence against the Native Americans in the mid to late 19th century, most prominently perhaps during the gold rush in California in the 1840s, 1850s, and beyond. So after the Civil War, for a 10-year period during the Plains Indian Wars, the U.S. government also practiced genocide when Indians refused to be pushed off their land onto reservations. So the third strategy was, when military subjugation wasn't entirely successful, the U.S. couldn't just kill all Indians. So the U.S. government used the third strategy, and that's education or cultural genocide. So this is the history of the Indian boarding schools, which the American government set up from the 1870s through most of the 20th century. As you know, prior to the U.S.-Mexico War, California belonged to Mexico. Before that, California was part of the northern frontier of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. But all of that changed when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2nd, 1848, to end the U.S.-Mexico War. Now, California belonged to the United States. Prior to this, and prior to the gold rush, California had a non-Indian population of fewer than 15,000 people. The non-Indian population consisted of a smattering of white Americans and runaway slaves. Others, the majority, were known as Californios, people of Spanish descent who owned land in California, and mestizos, or people of Spanish and indigenous descent. So the ethnic makeup of most Mexicans. By contrast, the Native American population was about 150,000 people. So you can see from this map the cultural and linguistic diversity of Native American tribes in California. The Sacramento area was and is the tribal land of the Nisenan people, the Southern Maidu people, and the Valley Miwok and Miwok people. There's also the Patwin, Winton, and Wintu peoples. But the discovery of gold was a huge turning point in California's history as the population increased dramatically. In January of 1848, just 1 month prior to the end of the U.S.-Mexico War, gold was discovered in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. After the discovery of gold, a mania for gold spread, and people rushed to California from around the world to find gold for themselves. The non-Native American population rose to 200,000 by 1852. That's up from 15,000, the previously cited number. By 1860, the population in California rose to 360,000 people. And people traveled from a variety of locations: Latin America and China, Ireland, Germany, Italy, France, and Australia. They also came from the eastern United States, overland by foot and buggy, as well as by sea. Native-born white Americans formed the single largest group of miners. More than half of the 90,000 people who arrived in California in 1849 were native-born white men from the eastern United States. So it's because of the gold rush that we see the growth of San Francisco. It grew from just about 1,000 people in 1848 to 30,000 in 1850 as it became the gateway for people trying to strike it rich. If you had more money, you would go by sea. Poorer people took the overland route, and this is a somewhat pixelated map that tells you shows what the routes look like. The vast majority of the people who came to California were men, but there were some women. So you know already that many women came to work as prostitutes and sex workers. They also ran boarding houses and worked as laundresses and cooks. In 1850, the population in California was 93% male. I should say the non-native population is 93% male, and mostly between the ages of 20 and 40. By 1860, California had about 3 times as many men as women. So the kind of mining people did early on was surface mining, which required little investment. But very quickly, surface mining was exhausted, giving way to underground mining that required large capital investments. As a result, larger mining companies took over, and many of the miners who came to strike it rich actually ended up working under very difficult conditions for wages for large mining companies. So they weren't working on their own, to strike it rich. They now were wage workers working for large mining companies. It's important to note that most miners never got rich from surface mining. In the earliest days of the gold rush, miners could make as much as $20 a day, which is a lot for 1848. But by 1853, they were lucky to earn $5 a day, a figure that would continue to decline over the course of the 1850s. As surface mining was drying up, racial conflict erupted as miners competed with one another for gold. White miners organized vigilante groups to expel quote-unquote foreign miners, including Mexicans, Chileans, Chinese, French, and American Indians. This white-led violence culminated in the California state legislature imposing a foreign miners tax of $20 per month, which had the result of driving people of color and European immigrants out of the state. The discovery of gold also resulted in comparatively early statehood for California in 1850. Other areas that were other regions of the Southwest taken from Mexico in the U.S.-Mexico War did not receive statehood so quickly. For instance, New Mexico didn't actually become a state until 1912, and part of the reason is that a significant portion of the New Mexican population was indigenous, so the U.S. government did not have an interest in establishing statehood for New Mexico in the same way that it did for California. A constitutional convention was held in California in 1849 to draw up not only the state's constitution, but also the territorial boundaries of the state. So the state constitution did some unusually progressive things. It outlawed slavery, and it gave women and wives the right to their own property. But it was also very racially discriminatory. So it explicitly limited voting and the right to testify in court to white people, including Native Americans, Asians, Native Americans, Asians, and the small number of African Americans then in the state. So now I want to turn to a slightly more in-depth look at the impact of the gold rush on Native Americans. It resulted, as historian Benjamin Madley has shown, in genocide of the Native American population. So the Native American population decreased from 150,000 in 1848 to just 30,000 in 1860. That's a decrease of 80%. So the Native American population decreases by 80% from 1848 to 1860. And this decrease was not about disease, by and large, but rather a result of violence. Gold seekers overran Native American communities. Miners, ranchers, and vigilantes murdered thousands of Native Americans. State officials paid millions of dollars to private militias to launch attacks on the state's Native American population to drive them off the land. So this is not just about white vigilante violence. An important takeaway point is that this is a government-sponsored campaign of extermination, not just mobs of people being violent toward Native Americans. So although California was technically a free state, thousands of Native American children who were declared orphans or vagrants were bought and sold as slaves. Whites enslaved about 10,000 California Indians between 1850 and 1863, forcing them to work in the mines and mining camps and as servants. So in his book, An American Genocide, the United States and the American Indian Catastrophe, historian Benjamin Madley meticulously documents the violence committed against Native Americans in California. Because the violence against natives was so intentional and systematic, he calls it, quote unquote, California's killing machine. He also makes clear that while disease, dislocation, removal, and starvation were important causes for the dramatic decrease in the Native American population, violence was even more important. There were, for instance, over 300 massacres, in addition to the enslavement of natives and individual homicides. So Benjamin Madley says that between 1850 and 1861, 3,414 state militiamen engaged in 24 campaigns directed explicitly at killing Native Americans. These state-sponsored killings inspired volunteer campaigns to kill Indians in the hopes of monetary reward, and the California state legislature provided the money for these campaigns. For example, in February of 1851, the California state legislature took out a $500,000 loan, which was a huge amount at the time, to pay for the militia expeditions. A year later, it passed a $600,000 bond measure to help fund the killing. After vicious attacks by militiamen, a Native American leader of the Modoc tribe said, quote, "We have lived here in peace, but we cannot get along with these white people. They come and kill my people for nothing, not only my men, but they kill our wives and children too. They will hunt us down worse than we hunted the deer or the antelope." So the United States Congress also endorsed the killing. So this is at the federal level as well, not just the state level. The Congress provided $924,000 to California to reimburse it for past militia operations. And then, during the Civil War, the federal government didn't just fund these campaigns, but took direct control of them, as U.S. troops engaged directly in killing Native Americans. Native American women experienced this violence disproportionately. Not only did they die of venereal diseases after being forced into prostitution, they also experienced sexual violence and killings in greater numbers. It bears repeating that Native Americans essentially had no recourse in the courts to protect themselves against this violence. All they could do was fight back. The California State Constitution had declared Native Americans non-citizens, so they could not serve on juries or vote. Moreover, like other people of color, they could not testify in court against white people committing this violence. So I want to end by commenting on how the history of the gold rush is normally told. I went to a gold rush museum in Mariposa, California, for instance. None of this history was told. Not one word of this history was told at this museum. So there's a sanitized version of the gold rush that we tell ourselves that results in the erasure of the actual history. And I'll go through a couple of images as examples. So here, this is, which one is it? Okay, so you can see that, it's a pretty small museum. It mainly talks about the daily lives of gold miners. Here's a case with drugs and other things. It has things like this, a letter written by a gold miner. It's supposed to be funny because he says that miners try to run away when the sheriff arrives to tell them they have to serve as jurors. He says, quote, "As soon as the miners see an officer coming, the shovels drop very quick, and such running and skulking would beat the Indians." So there's one reference to Native Americans, but it's of course, stereotypical depiction, but it also hints at something that's not being explicitly talked about at this museum, and that's genocide. So the main reference to Native Americans is this fake Miwok village, which consists of Indian basketry primarily. There's absolutely no mention of violence here. So, right, Native Americans, even though 80% of the population is killed during the gold rush and state-sponsored violence, this Miwok village has Indian basketry. There's also this area that talks about the Chinese, which is like the Miwok village, segregated from the other parts of the museum. So this sign says, quote, "Most of the Chinese left to migrate to larger cities such as San Francisco or return to China," unquote. As you'll see in the reading, this should read instead, quote, "They were violently driven out." But it does not acknowledge the violent past. So to conclude, I'll reiterate the 2 points I started with. So what was the impact of the gold rush on California? It resulted in the establishment of California as a state and a massive population increase. Intense racial conflict, culminating in the anti-Chinese movement in particular, as well as the genocide of Native Americans. And I think this history of genocide against Native Americans is important to know about because in and of itself, but it also has contemporary relevance. So Native Americans today are living in poverty in very high numbers. About 30% of natives live in poverty as compared to 11% of white people. And we can't divorce this reality from this longer history, this killing of Native Americans, taking their land and confining them to reservations with few resources.